Okay, welcome back. As usual, I hit a button that I shouldn't have, so I've learned something there as I'm working on the learning how to use this technology. What I was talking about was with experiments, the main purpose of an experiment is to try and establish a cause and effect relationship. This is the only research methodology which attempts to show that by stripping away, hopefully, anything that could influence the outcome to have produce the outcome other than what we're looking at. Remember the terminology. Let me go ahead and talk about the experiment, and then we'll talk about some other research methods. The experiment generally, when you look at the research process from beginning to end with an experiment, generally scientists come up with ideas for research by observing the environment around them, by reading research journals, by reading published research, and either replicating, thinking, I'd like to, see if I can get those results because that doesn't seem right, or it does seem right, or whatever it might be. Or the other thing can be that they read a study and go, well, that's interesting how that came out, but I wonder what would happen if I changed this little detail. Okay, so that's how the research starts for most scientists. That it's based upon a question that arises from a variety of sources because scientists are in the business because they're naturally inquisitive. So we start with a question. Then the researcher comes up with an aim, what they are trying to accomplish, that can be whatever they come up with, which it can be anything. It can be in psychology, it can be in biology, it can be in any field, but what I'm talking about is generically when we're talking about experiments, that's what happens. Then you come up with a hypothesis, which, as you know, also generates a null hypothesis. It's kind of almost a philosophical question, because even if you don't state the null hypothesis, as soon as you say the hypothesis, the opposite comes into existence. And the only thing we're ever looking to do is to either affirm the null hypothesis, accept it, or reject the null hypothesis. The reason is, even though we apply statistical methodologies, we can never for 100% assert that the hypothesis was proven. Remember how I've said to stay away from the word prove or proven. I slip, we all slip sometimes. That's not the proper terminology, though. Either research supports or research doesn't support. And when you're writing up your result of an experiment, what you're always doing first is either accepting or rejecting the null hypothesis. That will be the case also in your internal assessments, that you will either accept or reject the null hypothesis. But anyway, getting back to the process, you have an aim, you have hypothesis, you have null hypothesis. You then need to design how you're going to measure that. So usually there's an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is the one you manipulate, whatever it is that you are having the subject do, or whatever it is you're controlling. Then the dependent variable is the outcome you're looking at, what you're measuring. Sometimes I use an example, a silly example, that has to do with number of brownies eaten and score on a test, which are probably completely unrelated. But if that was what it was, we might have a group that eats no brownies, which would be our control group, and we may have an experimental group that eats 10 brownies before the exam. And then we just compare the results. Another way we could do that would be if we had independent measures designed. Excuse me. Another way we could do it is have the same group, say 20 people, that they do both conditions. All 20 people don't eat a brownie and take a test, and then all 20 people eat 10 brownies and take a test and compare their results. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of these. Independent measures, when we have two separate groups, you don't have the problem of the subjects becoming familiar with whatever you're attempting to test. Because in the second example I gave with repeated measures, you would have to have two different tests, because otherwise they might increase their score on the second one simply by being familiar with the questions, not having anything to do with the brownies. Okay? Another way sometimes to try and get around this is it's called matched pairs. And a matched pairs design is where our subjects, with our control group and our subjects in our experimental group, we try and match them up for as many criteria as are possible and relevant. Usually you match them for gender, usually you match them for age, and depending on what you're trying to measure, you would match them on other criteria also. So that's three different methods that you can use in order to design your research study. But you obviously always need a control group and you need an experimental group. Control group is the one that doesn't receive whatever the treatment is that you're trying to experiment on. The experimental group does receive it, whatever that is for that particular thing. An important aspect that sometimes is left out by beginning psychology students is operationalizing the variables. Okay? To operationalize the variable is to put something with, how to say it better, that's not good. It's what you can actually measure. Okay, it's one thing, let me back up on my brownies and test scores example, which is silly. Let's say that what I'm looking to measure is the effect of food on test scores. Okay, how am I measuring that? What kind of food am I talking about? What test scores am I talking about? Okay, so in my example, operationalizing is saying, okay, the food source is going to be brownies, and it's going to be the control group 0, no brownies, and the experimental group, in my silly example, 20 brownies. So that's operationalizing the independent variable. It's naming the substance, brownies, and how many. So there's a fixed measure. For the test scores, I'm going to say, I don't know, why don't we just say the Wechsler intelligence test? Probably you would never do that, and it's probably not going to have an effect anyway. But what we would look at then is their score on the Wechsler intelligence test. Okay, so that's the operationalizing. It's going from the concept of measuring food and intelligence, or food and some sort of test score, to saying it is this food and it is this test or this test score. Okay, that's a key element because, like I said, many times beginning psychology students forget to include that set. They've done it, but they haven't talked about it. Obviously, if you run that experiment I just talked about, you obviously did operationalize it, but a lot of times students forget to write that they had that they'd actually done that. The next thing you have to do is come up with the procedures. Now, what I actually have kind of skipped ahead, I'm just realizing, is at all times we have to be aware of our ethical standards. As we're coming up with what we want to study, how we're going to study it, we always have to be aware of our ethical standards. I don't know, I'll try and list all of them here. I'm not sure I can remember all of them just offhand. The first thing, of course, that we have to do is, as we're designing the study, we have to make sure that we do no harm to the subject. One of the things that we are charged with, just like doctors and everything else, is any research we do cannot end up harming the person in any way. And this includes not just like we think of physical harm. This includes emotional harm, psychological harm, or even to their beliefs. So if it's something that might be highly controversial material that they may need to look at, or something that might disturb them, we have to have safeguards in place so that the person walks out of the lab the same way they walked in. A part of this, when we're designing the research experiment, is informed consent. We must receive informed consent of our participants before they participate. Now, then usually the issue comes up of, well, what if it's necessary for me to do some if there's some